welcome. My name is Dawn Nelson and I work as an author and professional storyteller under the name Dee Storyteller. I do many different types of storytelling for all ages and I love to combine folklore with stories. After all, isn't that what they are? And so that's exactly what I've done with this story. It's an original tale written by myself and it is called The Legend of the Banshee. This is an October-themed tale with themes of death and murder, and it is not a tale for children. So if you have yourself a cup of coffee and you are sitting comfortably, then sit back and listen to The Legend of the Banshee. By the light of the candle the Banshee came, and Elizabeth knew her labour was in vain. There was once a husband and wife who were in the employ of a very wealthy family. It was a large family and there had been many children. And when I say had, I mean this because unfortunately this was a time when death was an all too frequent visitor to a household. Children were often lost within the first few months or even hours, and of course women also could lose their lives giving life. Now, this, of course, was something that afflicted many families during this time, but as such, there are two things which stand out as note for this family. One, there was a legend connected with them, and that is the legend of the Banshee. The Banshee would call out, wailing in the night, and sure enough, the very next day there would be a death in the household. Each time Elizabeth, the lady of the household, went into labour with a child, a candle would be lit in the household's window. This was to inform the village that there was a new bairn due. But the times when the child was unlikely to survive, well, the villagers did not need a candle to tell them that. No, it was the wailing of the Banshee that told them. And the Banshee never got it wrong. The other point of note is that this family employed a keener. A keener is a professional mourner, and due to the unfortunate deaths in this family, they had a permanent member of the community in their employ. This person was Mary. Mary was married to a sin-eater, another interesting profession associated with death. John had chosen this profession as it seemed to be an easy one, and after all he had to do was, if someone died without confession, then before the burial of the body, it would be laid out in a room for John to visit. In the room was a piece of bread and a glass of wine, and by eating and drinking these items, John was eating and drinking the sins of the deceased. What those sins for one so young could be, goodness only knows, but this was a family tradition. And Mary and John had fallen in love over their mutual ambivalence when it came to death. Mary and John, well, they never had a lot. Their life was a frugal one, but they made do, and they were good people despite the stigma of their chosen roles. They had peat for the fire, plenty of it, and small ale and bread, and well, the master up at the manor, he said they were very welcome to fresh milk and cheese whenever they wanted it from the manor house. John worked a little plot of land and grew vegetables, and they had plenty of those, and the chickens, well, they kept them in eggs. The couple, though, they did have a secret. Mary knew of the Banshee legend, and she played to it. But this was only with good intentions. She had a knack when it came to knowing things, knowing what could happen in the future, and she found that that often eased these happenings. So, because she knew these things, she knew whether or not Elizabeth's children would live or die. And so she was the Banshee that warned them. And she was very careful that they would never find out. So the Banshee was no fairy in this case, no ghost, no spirit, no. This legendary Banshee was Mary, a very human Mary. No one questioned the fact that the Banshee had only started appearing when Mary had been employed as a keener. Mary made sure that this stayed this way, as she considered the Banshee role as, well, part of her job. That year, Elizabeth buried the last child she was to give birth to. She was tired, and neither her nor her husband could live with the grief that hung in their hearts any more. They had 4 healthy children who were growing up strong, and the master had the son that he needed to inherit the land. But with 6 other children in the ground, Elizabeth's heart was heavy, and having just buried the last one, she could not bury another. Mary heard them talking and knew that this meant less work for her and John. Elizabeth's parents were long gone, and so were the master's. The next in the family to require any kind of funeral would be Elizabeth or her husband, and more than likely her husband, as he was quite a bit older than Elizabeth. But even so, it was very unlikely that this would happen soon. He was a healthy man. She said this much to John one evening as they were eating supper. John liked his life. It was easy, simple, and they had what they needed. He did not want to move. Why should he move? Why should he look for another family, as this was what Mary was suggesting? He'd given this family the best of his years. Sin-eaters were not welcomed people, and John had become reclusive and bitter, and whether or not you believe that he really did consume the sins of the unconfessed dead or not, John did. And this ate away at him. It was as he was digging over the vegetable plot the next day that he came up with a plan. He relayed this to Mary, as he would need her help. "We have a good life here, Mary. We have no need to move. Why don't you wail at the window of the master, and it will surely frighten him to death, and then the mistress will have to remarry, and her new husband will surely want more children, and, well, then we'll be back in business." "Don't be ridiculous," said Mary. "I'm not being ridiculous. Do you want to move?" Well, Mary thought about it, and she didn't really. She liked their life as well, but she also didn't actually think that her wailing would frighten a man to death. And so she thought in order to keep John quiet, she would agree to it. So she did. It was a dark new moon that night as she stood beneath the window where the master slept. And she wailed. Her voice echoed around the manor house. This would be her last performance before they had to move on, because surely this would not work. Neither did she really want it to work. Elizabeth and her husband did hear this and lived in fear for many days, until eventually the master found himself ill, ailing badly, and he took to his bed. Elizabeth nursed him. Now, John had not told Mary of the second half of his plan, for he too was not entirely sure that Mary's wailing would finish off the old man, and he was actually as surprised as she was when the old man took to his bed. So he'd created a little bit of insurance. He knew which room the family nursed their sick in, and in the night he crept in and left wine on the bedside table. The family often took wine for medicinal purposes, and so it would not be queried, and when the master awoke in the night with a coughing fit and found the wine on the table, well, he drank it without a second thought. That night, as John lay in bed waiting for the news of the master's death, he heard a far-off cry, a keening, wailing catcall. Perhaps Mary had gone to reinforce the rumour of the Banshee. He wasn't sure, and he reached out, but found Mary was sleeping softly beside him in the bed. There must be a fox, he thought, and turned over to go back to sleep. But the calling got louder and louder until he felt sure it was right outside their house. It chilled him to the bone, and he scolded himself for being so foolish. There was no such thing as banshees. It was surely a cat lost. After food, perhaps. It would be gone in the morning. Of course, the master was found dead in the morning and had died without confession, and so the sin-eater was called. Elizabeth was distraught as she prepared the room, and so when she saw half a glass of wine already on the bedside table, well, she did not think to change it. Why let it go to waste? And so she simply topped it up with a little more wine and placed a piece of bread beside it. John entered the room and sat beside the bed of the man he knew he had killed. He took the wine and the bread in his hands, and he muttered, "It is not your sins, sir, that I come to eat. It is my own, and I ask forgiveness, but I only do what is needed." And he took the wine and the bread, and as he muttered these words, the family waited patiently outside the room for him to finish his duties. But John did not come out of the room. John had drunk the wine that he had laced with deadly nightshade. John was dead. When Mary heard the news, she keened for her own loss. She too had heard the wailing outside their house in the night, and now she knew. The Banshee was not just a legend. The Banshee was real. That's my version of the legend of the Banshee, and it uses the folklore of the Banshee and combines it with the very real roles of the keener and the sin eater. I hope you enjoyed that story, and if you did, then please do join me on Facebook. You'll find me under DD Storyteller, on Instagram as @DD_storyteller, and you can rewild yourself through story via my Patreon, where I tell many more stories like this, both traditional and original stories. I do audio stories, pre-recorded videos, and digital zines. And you can find me over on Patreon, again, as DD Storyteller. I do hope to see you there, as I'd love to tell you another story. See you soon. Toodle pip.